Welcome to the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast, Week 1 XFL DFS edition. Over the next few weeks, we'll be bringing you XFL DFS picks and lineup advice, strategies for FanDuel and DraftKings, first looks, reviews, you name it. Everything in between, we'll be doing it for you. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, and I'm joined today, and we'll be joined in the future on all of these XFL DFS episodes, by our NFL writer Chris, and this Chris Rooney at CDR02989 on Twitter. And just when we thought the NFL grind was over, Chris, we're right back at it. What's up, man?
Yeah, how you doing, Brian? It's really fun to be still thinking about some football. I know it's not quite at the level of NFL, but this game is going to be different. The XFL is working hard to sort of spice up their rules a little bit to make things a little more entertaining for the fans and for us as fantasy players. So, why don't we dive on in and talk about how this is all going to work?
For sure. So for this Week 1 XFL DFS episode, here's what we have in store, just so you know exactly what to expect for this episode. We'll start with an introduction to XFL DFS in general and why it should be so profitable. We'll talk about how to gain an edge on this weekend's Week 1 slate. We'll talk about injuries to monitor for Saturday and Sunday's matchups. And finally, we'll talk about what content to expect from us here at Occupy Fantasy for this XFL DFS season. So if you like what we're doing, go ahead and click that subscribe button. If you're listening to this in your podcast apps, do that there. If you're watching this on YouTube, also click that subscribe button. That way you get the latest podcasts, latest videos, latest analysis directly to your feed. So, Chris, let's jump into this. And I think XFL DFS will provide perhaps the best of both worlds. We'll get the research-driven analysis like NFL preseason and college football that we've done so well in the past with here at Occupy Fantasy. And as long as the data is provided after Week 1 like we think it'll be, we'll be able to provide those underperformers like you pointed out so often in our NFL Daily Plug.
Yeah, so, if those were with us for NFL preseason, those who were following, Lucas when he was covering college football, a lot of that, time that is spent consuming news and really trying to figure out who the key players are going to be week in and week out. That's going to be a big part of at least the beginning of this XFL season because we just don't have a lot of statistical trends or information to go off of. I mean, let's be real here. There are people out there saying that they are XFL quote unquote experts, but this is a brand new league where there has not been a single regular season snap under the rules that they have created for this brand of football. So, we'll do the best we can here to use general fantasy football knowledge, principles, and, game theory. But to anyone out there saying that they're an expert on this is taking it a little too far, in my opinion.
Yeah, and we'll actually hit on why that's a good thing for us. Why a little bit later in this episode, why we think the fact that so many people are calling themselves XFL experts will help us out in DFS. So, all right, this is a new DFS sport as well. So, Chris, what are the formats and lineup requirements both for FanDuel and DraftKings?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with DraftKings just because personally, those who've been following me here for a while know that's primarily where I play. This is a 7-person lineup in their classic style, a fantasy different than the NFL version. You start 1 quarterback, 1 running back. There are 2 wide receiver slots, and you have 2 flex slots and a defense. So there's no requirement to play a tight end here. There's 1 less running back slot and 1 less, wide receiver slot that you have to fill. That extra flex makes things interesting. And what DraftKings decided to do was they actually lumped the tight ends. So anyone that's a tight end on the actual XFL roster, if you're on the XFL website, they're actually considered a wide receiver by DraftKings. So still with the $50,000 salary cap here. So that'll be familiar to players on DraftKings. And, initially this was actually kind of interesting last week when we were looking at this, right? DraftKings was going to, I think, make this like a 4-game showdown slate with, a captain and the 5 flex spots. And I know you were kind of intrigued by that challenge, but the majority, I think, of the DFS universe was kind of really not happy with that. So credit to DraftKings for sort of reacting and actually giving us a more familiar format here. Over on the FanDuel side of things, there are no defenses in your lineup. Still no kickers, so FanDuel stuck with that change, which was a recent innovation, I think, in their NFL product in the last couple of years. But you have pretty similar format to DraftKings otherwise. There'll be 1 quarterback, one running back, I believe. Let me just check my lineups because, like I said, I haven't actually looked at this as much.
And they also have, while you're looking that up, they have the $100 salary cap, which is
Right,
a bit
right.
different than their
Yeah.
usual 60K for NFL.
Yeah, so it is the one running back requirement as well. They have two. They're calling it a wide receiver slash tight end slot. So, I guess that's another difference with FanDuel here. They will be quote unquote properly listing a tight end as a tight end, but you can effectively treat it the same way as you would on DraftKings, and they have two flex spots. So obviously, still half point PPR over on FanDuel, still full point PPR on DraftKings. We still have our 3-point bonus thresholds on DraftKings for 300 yards passing, 100 yards rushing, 100 yards receiving. So all of those things will come into play. It's just a little bit of a different way to build a fantasy football lineup with this sport.
Yeah, and I was a little biased when DraftKings introed that potential showdown product, but there's still going to be showdown. FanDuel has already put out showdown contests, single game contests for this weekend, so we'll still have that aspect of it. So a lot of similar showdown, single game theory, and lineup construction will apply to this sport.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't many major changes, and in fact, one of our OccupyFantasy.com members, Joe Schofield, reached out to us on Twitter asking, what are some of the differences between the rules in college football, NFL compared to XFL. And while I don't think many of these will have an effect on the way we build lineups, but there are some slight changes that we should be aware of.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I mean, I'll try to hit on the big ones, but just go to XFL.com. Right across the top of their menu header there, they have rules. You can click on that. You can read about every single one that they have that's different than the NFL. They actually do a nice job of laying all of them out and explaining how what they want to do is different from both NFL and college rules that you may be used to. I think the big ones that we need to focus on from a fantasy point scoring perspective, the extra points and how overtime's potentially going to work here, as well as clock management. Those are sort of the three big things that will either drive scoring or restrict scoring. And I don't think people are fully sure what's going to happen here. We think the XFL will be a little bit more of a high scoring league, but we just don't know. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. There's a 1, 2, and 3-point conversion after touchdowns in the XFL, but there's no kick. So the 1-point conversion would be your traditional point after play from the 2-yard line that we're used to seeing in the NFL. It's just worth 1 point. If they step back 1 yard and they elect to run a play from the 3-yard line, that is going to be the XFL's version of a 2-point play. Then things get really wacky where you can run one play from the 10-yard line for 3 points. So it'll be really interesting, Brian, I think, to see what coaches decide to do with all of those options after touchdowns. I think we both think that they will most often go for 2 points, but you just don't know.
Yeah, the one thing I am sure of is that analytics Twitter will immediately be angry no matter what happens. So we'll be on the lookout for that. But the thing is, your players will get rewarded with fantasy points for any of those conversion types: 1 point, 2 point, 3 points, passing or receiving or rushing. So that's pretty important too. All right, let's move on to the weekend, the schedule of games and what the slates look like. Right. FanDuel is doing a 2-game slate. Two 2-game slates. DraftKings is doing the big 4-game slate. Chris, is very similar to what we see in the NFL playoffs.
Yeah, so you have the 4 individual games with different start times. You hit it exactly like NFL playoffs, wildcard weekend, divisional weekend. So a big thing here is going to be, managing that potential late swap strategy, understanding who the key players are going to be on every single team, and obviously also on the teams that play on Sunday, especially in that late window on Sunday. That's going to potentially give you an advantage if you leave those spots open for as long as possible, unless we just really love, the game stack or whatever in that first window on Saturday. I think that's going to be a week-to-week thing. There are a couple teams that I think we all agree are probably going to be more explosive than the others. And actually this week, it looks like one of them does play the very first game. So that's something we will have to consider, but that's going to change every single weekend.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and that strategy, and late swap, and we'll talk about this here as we move on to how to gain an edge in XFL DFS, especially for Week 1. We'll talk about how the timing of the games will impact your lineup. So you mentioned it earlier, Chris. You said no one's an XFL expert, right? whether it's in your Twitter bio or not doesn't make it real. So people, we know anyone can research these players' histories, right? We've done that. Anyone can look at the depth charts. We've done that. And we feel that some of the very large contingents on Twitter will have an impact on ownership. And there are a couple other things that will have a huge impact on ownership. And knowing that there's a ton of uncertainty for XFL, no one knows exactly how this is going to play out because they've never played it before. We've never seen any of these teams in real action. But you combine that with the perceived knowledge of people on Twitter, the players that are going to be in DFS contests. This to me is a perfect setup, especially in week one, for high-risk contests, big tournaments, satellites, qualifiers. It looks to be we'll find a lot of leverage spots, I think, in this first week.
Yeah, for sure. We have these XFL lines and totals actually that just came out today. And so I think a lot of people are going to use those as we always do in fantasy football to sort of drive their decision making. But I'm just not sure how much we should really, trust these lines. I feel like the bookmakers are having just as much difficulty as we are as fans figuring out who the best teams are going to be. There's been a lot of talk on Twitter of quote unquote experts on those win totals for the full season and how accurate they are. So this is like the perfect opportunity to almost take advantage of that and look at, I guess, some of the underdogs on this slate and maybe try and identify some of those opportunities with those teams in your DFS lineups. Big thing here in week one was really on both FanDuel and DraftKings. If you were listening to us for that slate, there were some really strong satellites for the big opening weekend GPPs on DraftKings and FanDuel for XFL. So a lot of people out there have a ton of tickets for this weekend. Hopefully a lot of our members have tickets for this weekend. And this is probably, like you said, the best way to try and really turn those tickets into a really big prize because, there are a couple teams people will focus on just by going the other way in a couple of key spots here, right? And we'll talk about that, I think, a little later on in the week in the Daily Plug in on Twitch when we finally pull that together to talk about the games in detail. We'll hopefully give you some of the best spots to really kind of leverage the field and do that with.
Yeah, so two key points here. So the spreads are out for these games. Like you said, totals just dropped at one sports book in Vegas like an hour before we started recording. And the two things here. One, with all of the favorites, if you look at betting action at any sports book, 70-80% of the early action was on every favorite. And that's not unusual, favorites getting more of the action just because that's the way the public bets. But because there's nothing to go on and the public is trusting these sports books to make the right lines, they are more in line with the favorite, right? They're betting the favorite at a historical rate. And we're going to see the same thing with DFS. These teams as favorites will have higher team totals naturally. So ownership will be concentrated on those four teams, I believe, especially the two with the highest spreads. But the second part of this, and it goes hand in hand, is these limits on these XFL games are not that high. So Circus Sports, where we saw the XFL totals, which we tweeted just before this podcast we started recording, their XFL totals are just $300 limits. The most you can bet on a total is $300. The most you can bet on a side, the spread there, is $1,000. Considering a week ago they were taking up to $200,000 on the side in the Super Bowl. During the regular season they were taking $100,000 and $200,000. $1,000 is nothing, and it shows that we have no reason to be confident in what these lines are.
Yeah, I mean, the bookmakers are trying to figure out what they should be doing here as well. That's really what that tells us if you want to just boil it down to a real simple point, right? And it makes sense. I mean, it's a brand new league, just a ton of uncertainty all around. So, beyond that, right? I mean, we have players that look. I mean, people are going to look at the XFL and say, why would I watch this? I mean, these guys weren't good enough to make it into the NFL. How good can this product possibly be? And to some degree, I kind of get what they're saying, but I think football in general, just to spend a second on this, has really been suffering from a lack of some kind of developmental place for players to go in between college and the NFL. I mean, we have preseason, but that's a really short window of time. And we saw, with the league that folded after last year, the Alliance, plenty of guys actually made the leap into making NFL rosters and being valuable contributors to NFL teams. So, I think the XFL hopes to set themselves up to be a place for players to go start their professional careers if they're sort of in between being really high draft prospects and for sure NFL starters. They can come to a place like the XFL and really make a name for themselves and hopefully make an NFL roster. So I think, this is going to be a good experiment. I think the business is set up a little bit better than last year's league was from a financing standpoint. So, I think this is going to work. I think we're at least going to see this last a year or two, and they'll certainly take it from there from a business standpoint. But I guess what I'm saying is there are plenty of players here that are hungry. They have a lot of things to play for. And so we can take advantage of that. We can see which ones will help us make some money on our end as well.
No, absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely set up better than the AAF, and I think this won't be the only season of XFL DFS. So I imagine this will be around in 2021 and beyond. So, all right, let's get back to talking about these initial spreads. So while there's not a lot to take from the opening lines, as always, we can take a look at what the betting market is telling us, because these bookmakers are letting the betting market shape these lines, and we've had two big line moves in these 4 games so far since the lines have opened. So the first big one is a 3-point move towards the New York Guardians. They're playing the Tampa Bay Vipers. They opened as a 5-point favorite. Tampa Bay did. They're now down to 2, despite getting most of the action. So some sharp money, I assume, here on New York. Chris, that'll be a big spot for us, and I imagine we'll talk about that in the daily plug. And then secondly, there is a 3.5-point move in favor of the Dallas Renegades. They opened as 6.5-point favorites. They're now 10-point double-digit favorites. So, Chris, I really like that New York spot, and again, I think ownership won't be as concentrated there as some of these other teams.
Yeah, most people don't necessarily look at this movement, right? So they're going to see that the Vipers are still favored, but that's a pretty decent size move back towards New York. New York is actually the home team there, so it should be a friendly crowd for them, and that stuff does matter a little bit. Have a quarterback in Matt McGloin that actually does have some NFL experience, so I love New York. We'll definitely talk about that in the plug on Twitch, but should be interesting. And I'm glad we covered the spreads here a little bit, because we're going to apply a lot of the same principles that we apply to analyzing NFL at the high level anyway for this stuff. So that's sort of the knowledge standpoint that we have to work off of, that we can leverage and use. We know that home favorite running backs are probably going to be popular in fantasy football. That should probably still be the same here in the XFL. The only thing is that we don't really know what a workhorse back is actually going to look like in this league yet. So that's really the only hang up here with that.
Yeah. So we have these totals, we have these spreads, and that'll be one of the 3 key components in week 1 for how we project ownership for these large field contests. So the favorites will naturally drive a lot of ownership. 2 other areas that I think will drive ownership. One, Chris, are these depth charts, which were a little hard to find early in the week. We are recording this Thursday afternoon, but the XFL just released official depth charts on their website, xfl.com, for each team. And Twitter is abuzz analyzing them. And secondly, I guess in conjunction with that, in conjunction with depth charts, we can also look at how highly these players were drafted in the XFL initial draft. That'll combine. And then number 3 is players, whether it's college, AAF, or especially their NFL experience. All of this will combine to, I think, give us a really accurate number on ownership projections for week 1.
Yeah, for sure. And, there are guys that have, dominated their teams at every level of football that are on some of these XFL rosters. And so those are probably the ones that, we should expect to be some of the most popular players this week, independent of, all that other stuff, the spreads and totals and whatnot. There are just players that people are going to look at and go, there's a pretty good chance this is going to be the best wide receiver on this team, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the ones that we're going to identify, point out to people. And not just that, we're going to look at the ones that might actually be sort of the hidden gems here to start that, let's say, for example, these depth charts aren't exactly fully accurate, and we know there's a wide receiver that actually has the ability to dominate opportunity on his team. Let's say there's an injury situation, that we can leverage, and then there's, some things about a player that we know based off of their history in other leagues that we can discuss. These are going to be the things we're going to have to look at as we start the year here. Hopefully, as things move on, we'll get some more of the things that we're used to in fantasy football, like air yards, like routes run and stuff like that, that we can really use to infer more intelligently how we should be deploying players in our lineups.
Yeah, all very good points. Until we get that statistical data, We're going to be using a lot of game theory, a lot of DFS lineup construction advice that we use all the time to be able to get the best plays. And just to give a quick example of how I think this ownership will shake out. So let's talk about just really quickly. All three of those factors line up pretty well for Jarrell Presley, right? For DC, he's the starting running back. He was a third-round pick. He's listed at the top of the depth chart. DC is a relatively big favorite, and he was relevant in the AAF. So all these factors, and I think he has a pretty high salary too on DraftKings and FanDuel. So this says to me, this is a great example of all these three factors line up, and Presley will be one of the highest owned guys. Chris, that's the line of thinking you have too, right?
Yeah, for sure. And, I'm actually really glad that you brought up salary, because I think that's something that we want people to actually realize, understand, and think about here. With most DFS sports that we play, really with all DFS sports that we play, we're used to this idea that the higher price players are the better ones. And I'm not going to completely dissuade people here. In most cases here, even with XFL, that is true. But because this is a brand new league, there's actually a ton, at least in our opinion, of mispriced players, particularly at the wide receiver position. So we don't necessarily need to worry about hitting, our salary cap here. In fact, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Salary may not even be a problem, at least to start the season, because we can build viable lineups with as little as maybe 70% of the salary dollars we have available to us on either site, maybe even less than that.
Yeah, I mean, DraftKings, if you use all starters from the depth charts on the team website, you can build a lineup that's reasonable with stacks and all starters with just $25,000 of your DraftKings budget. So that's literally half. So you bring up a great point, and this will be a big edge in week one, especially in tournaments, where the salaries were released with really no information to go on aside from draft stock. And with the depth charts out now and with some practice reports, we have a little bit clearer picture of who's going to be on the field. And with uncertain roles, we have the ability to use way less salary. So this might end up even looking like a Pro Bowl slate where the winning lineup has like 15,000 left over on DraftKings. So first and foremost, I would say, especially in tournaments, don't use your entire salary cap. But in our daily plug, which will be released on Friday evening, we'll give you some more concrete salary restrictions and requirements and ranges. But just know that that'll be one of the biggest ways to gain leverage in this first week. So let's talk about some other ways to gain an advantage in week one, and that's with some lineup strategies. So in addition to not using all of your salary, stacking is still going to be very important. The very core fundamentals of football are still in place for XFL. So Chris, using some 2x1, 3x1, 3x2 stacks, especially in tournaments, will be viable once again.
Yeah, for sure. And then, as we always talk about, I play a little more low risk than tournaments. I'm not sure I'm going to do that to start out here in XFL, because I don't know if we can really consider anything. But, when you're playing double ups, 50-50s, head to heads, you want to maximize volume of opportunity with the players in your lineup. So focusing on running backs on those favorite teams, or just running backs that we have some information that they will basically have large roles. Those are the ones we're going to want to use both at our running back slot and in our flex spots to try and really kind of get a nice floor of fantasy point production in our lineups. And, I think in many ways, we've become kind of lazy as DFS players. And I guess what I'm trying to say is there's just so much out there, and we appreciate people that come here, to occupy, obviously, for the help, for the models, for the plugs, for the advice, but understand that a lot of that information to start out with XFL that people offer around the industry is just not going to be as good as it is, or as like statistically valid, if that makes sense, for other sports. So, this is really going to be almost like an old school kind of DFS sport where it really does come down to just outworking the competition, understanding the news, having a hunger for really just finding the information. And that's what we're here for, to help you do as we start the season.
Yes, exactly. We're here. So you and I will be contributing to the Daily Plug. Lucas, our college football writer, key NFL preseason researcher, niche sport researcher, he'll be contributing a huge amount as well. So be sure to tune in for that. All right, so we've talked about stacking. We've talked about flex spots. We've talked about anticipated roles. We're doing all this research for you, by the way. We'll present it in a nice, digestible format in the Daily Plug. You won't have to do any of this work yourself. We'll do it for you. We talked about salary usage. The last thing to talk about, well, I guess there's two things to talk about. One is late swap. So with these games, no games going on at the same time. Each game individually happening, whether it's the FanDuel 2-game slate, whether it's the DraftKings 4-game slate. Not only will you need to be available to late swap for any contest type, just to make sure you give yourself the best winning percentage chances, we might not have all the information for Sunday's games, right? I mean, I imagine there will be some information right before all these games lock that comes out that Lucas will find and we'll put in the Daily Plug. So by having the ability, the flexibility to stick around Saturday night, and read our updates in the Daily Plug, you'll be able to swap to guys that are going to be way lower owned just because you were ready and willing and to go by your phone or computer.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we're used to the NFL posting inactives, I think about an hour and a half game kicks off. So, you know, you got normal slates in that league, right, where everybody's starting at 1 o'clock or 4:25 or whatever. So you get the inactives at the same time. Because these games are staggered, you know, we're going to have to deal with that on a week-to-week basis, on a game-to-game basis. Thankfully, it looks like the XFL is looking to implement some of the same protocols that the NFL follows for that reporting. The league's website has pretty good data on their transactions, injury report available. So, you know, we're going to be consuming that and reporting that back to you as well in the middle of slates because, as you said, Brian, you know, we're not going to know about those Sunday games in particular on Saturday probably and which players are going to be inactive. You know, there's probably going to be at least one player this weekend that is a super high salary player that is not going to be playing this weekend. And that's, you know, we have some injuries obviously already that we're aware of that we can cover here, but you know, that's going to be probably one of the bigger things that plays into the slate here as we kick off the season. You know, I don't think people are as aware yet of the information that is available to them about these injuries.
No, you're 100% right. Even though these are now publicly available injuries, it's still not the easiest data to find, especially on context as to the injury, how it happened, what the actual injury is. We just have practice reports. So we'll dig into that information for you, find what we can. So I think all of this combines just to say you need to leverage ownership in week one. Mm-hmm. And in the Daily Plug, we will list guys who we think will be the highest owned players. And a very simple way to be able to leverage this are two receivers on the same team. One meets all the criteria above that will end up being a highly projected owned player. His teammate, we have no idea how target shares, air yard shares will pan out. Right. We have a very small idea. And we have a guy who's cheaper, way lower owned, potentially more target volume. That's a very easy lever spot. We'll find tons of spots like that this weekend. We'll be sure to point those out to you. But, I mean, that's going to be, number one, the easiest way, using all this information and fading the ownership because, again, no one actually knows what's going to happen.
Right. I mean, I guess just to give people an example, you know, we're not necessarily prepared to make this recommendation here. You know, with those DC defenders, right? Yeah. Everybody knows this Rashad Ross, you know, NFL preseason hero, AAF hero, MVP in that league, a Hall of Famer in that league. You know, he's the most expensive skill position player on the DraftKings slate. He has a teammate in Malachi Dupree who is $3,000 on DraftKings, a full $7,400 less than Ross. You know, is there more, you know, does that mean his production is guaranteed to be 30% of that of Ross's? No, it doesn't. So these are the things that we're going to highlight in the Daily Plug for you, not just this week, every single week until we get more information to be able to make more precise projections for you.
Yeah, and on the flip side of that, because Rashad Ross was listed as a backup on the initial depth chart for whatever reason, now all the sharks may be jumping in and say, fade Rashad Ross, play Malachi Dupree, and we get Rashad Ross at 5% ownership. Right. So we're going to be very aware of all the recommendations being made in the industry, what people are saying on Twitter, and we're going to find the leverage one way or another. So, all right, you mentioned some week one injuries just really quickly. We're not going to get too in depth here, but 5 or 6 guys we need to keep an eye on their status heading into Saturdays and Sundays games. Chris, 2 quarterbacks, Josh Johnson. Most people will remember him from NFL regular season. He's a quarterback for LA. He's not likely to play. And then Landry Jones, former Pittsburgh quarterback, Oklahoma quarterback. He's with the Dallas Renegades here. He is questionable, hurt his knee a few weeks ago. iffy to play. Likely will be back for week 2, but these are two guys where we might find cheaper backup quarterback options for DFS.
Yeah, exactly. The Dallas one in particular is interesting just because Dallas is such a huge favorite here in week 1. With their starting quarterback highly questionable to play, that already jumps out to me anyway as an opportunity to really kind of look at that game a little more closely and figure out what's going on. We have some wide receivers as well. Trey McBride, also with the Los Angeles Wildcats, has a thigh injury. This is a wide receiver that has some NFL pedigree, NFL experience. Surprised to see that he was listed as a backup on the depth chart, but I'm to understand in these, I guess, early hours after the depth charts were officially released is that the players listed at the top right now are simply the players they expect to start in week 1. So these depth charts are probably going to move around a bit. Trey McBride, while he may not play or if he's active, may not have a huge role here in week 1 for Los Angeles against the Roughnecks. Obviously that could, hey, we're learning these team names too, folks. McBride probably could grow into a larger role as the season goes on. I know Lucas is upset about Jazz Ferguson, who also plays for the Dallas Renegades, teammate of Landry Jones. Seems to be questionable with a hand injury. And then we have Kason Williams, who actually is still listed on on the Seattle Dragons depth chart as their top wide receiver, right? He's got a quad injury, so that sounds a little dicey as well.
Yeah, so 5 guys that we think should have major roles when they're healthy to keep an eye on. And again, there will be some more guys beyond this list. We're updating all of this in the Daily Plug. And as updates come in, even through Saturday through Sunday, that'll be updated. So we talked about the Daily Plug quite a few times, Chris. Let's talk about what viewers and members can expect from OccupyFantasy.com for this XFL DFS season. So we have this podcast, which will come out at the very latest Thursday evenings every single week. This week is more of a preview, what to expect, where the following weeks will be more of recapping the previous week's usage, maybe some look aheads to the Saturday and Sunday games. We will do a weekly Twitch. The time is yet to be determined, but twitch.tv/OccupyFantasy. Moose will host. One or more of us will join him to analyze and take your questions live. And then we'll have the ultimate XFL Daily Plug, very similar to how we did NFL preseason, similar to how we did college football. Lineup strategies, all the advice you need from a high level of how to approach this slate, top plays, and then some team-by-team notes. Chris and Lucas will be writing that. Chris, looking forward to reading those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess just for the listeners that are used to, hearing you and Waleed, or I guess you and myself, because we've done this a couple times now, talk about football slates and how to attack them from a DFS perspective. Obviously, our goal is to take this show and get it to be more like that as the season moves on. We just don't have the information right now to be able to really do that for you at this stage of the year. So looking forward to being able to put the plug together. Everybody should expect the exact same quality plug that they were getting for NFL, for college football from Lucas. We're now kind of putting our powers together, if you will, to give you the best of both worlds.
Yep, 100%. And we can't guarantee the following content pieces yet. We are holding out hope that they'll be available. Perhaps DFS Magic, the ability to build 150 XFL lineups. We're working on that pretty hard. Advanced stats, we're more than likely this will be a thing. I'm sure XFL will be at least as good as the AAF in providing advanced data. So we'll provide all advanced data for you as well. And then perhaps an XFL model, depending on quite a few things. But the bare minimum, you will get this podcast, you will get this Twitch, and you'll definitely get the Daily Plug, which is the flagship product at OccupyFantasy.com. All right, that does it for this Week 1 XFL DFS podcast. Be sure to subscribe, whether it's in your podcast app or on YouTube. If you're watching this again on YouTube, go ahead and click that subscribe, click the like button. And if you have questions, comments, reach out to us, leave a review, comment on YouTube, reach out on Twitter at OccupyFantasy. Chris, any final thoughts?
I guess the only other thing we missed here, Brian, is make sure on Twitch that you're subscribed so you can nag us in Discord for questions about XFL. We're willing to do that as well. But other than that, looking forward to this season kicking off and continuing to offer, the same high quality advice we've been offering all NFL season throughout the XFL season.
Yes, sir. So for Chris, I'm Brian for Occupy Fantasy. We appreciate you listening. We'll see you guys in the Daily Plug. We'll see you on Twitch. And if not, we'll see you next week on the Week 2 XFL DFS podcast.